And so we're now moving on to a paper from Michelle Evans on collective leadership in the Queensland Indigenous Labour Network. I was really thrilled when Michelle submitted a paper to this conference. I really, really love your writing, Michelle. So it's over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind. Let me start off by also doing an acknowledgement of country. It's just in the next slide. I'm here as a guest on the country of the Wiradjuri Nation in Australia here, and I live in Albury, New South Wales, on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, or what is known as the Millawabilla in Wiradjuri language, the Great Murray River, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all of you who are here today. This work is it's in its emergent stage. We've been running a major national project for quite a while, for nearly 5 years, to really get some understanding about representation and leadership of Australian Indigenous peoples across the two major political parties in Australia, and to really study what it's like to operate inside of the political parties. What does leadership look like inside of these spaces, and how are the individuals really spanning community and cultural expectations, as well as party responsibilities. As you can imagine, quite a tense and interesting spot to jump into. So we have endeavoured to interview every single Indigenous candidate for the two major parties over a period of a decade, between 2010 and 2020. That was our scope period, and it's been an incredible project. But the one thing I want to talk a little bit about today is the Queensland Indigenous Labour Network. And just let me say that I'm quite interested personally in the intersection between our thinking, or the field's thinking, around collective leadership, and also the really quite well-established work on Indigenous leadership. And I think there are some interesting kind of tensions and intersections here that we can start to look at and notice. And I'm going to use the Queensland Indigenous Labour Network. Really, it's more of a case example to look at how groups of individuals over long periods of time and certain kind of flashpoints of time are able to pick up and put down and create some change inside of a quite white structure, which is really very interesting. But if we're looking at leadership, going back to Contractor et al. In 2012, so quite a while ago, but we're talking about the complexity of multiple individuals, multiple roles, and this element of time. And so that's some of the themes that I've noticed coming up in this particular case. And for Indigenous leadership, as many of you would be have read and have researched yourselves, Indigenous leadership is more than often about not just individual or the self, but about groups and communities, and these kind of greater goals of self-determination and taking responsibility for moving forward for future generations. So I think that's very important work to notice as we go forward into this case. As I said, the larger project has been going on for quite a while, and I think we've probably done way more interviews than even that, to tell you the truth. It just kind of continues on, and we get so interested, we want to interview more people, trying to stick to scope. But we've been able to interview over 70 Indigenous candidates, or now representatives, and that's a whole other story. But we also interviewed a range of non-Indigenous members of party, whether it was at grassroots or people who have really been a part of that allyship of getting much more Indigenous representation. And and at the membership level, and also at the party elite level or the structural level, to understand how targets have been set and how that's been changing culturally these organisations. But back to the QILN, as it is known, or Queensland Indigenous Labour Network. It really, in our study across Australia, it was the most highly organised First Nations grassroots membership body at any level across state territories, federal, and it really did rise out of not just Indigenous members of the Labor Party in Queensland, but working with really important ministers and allies in certain branches across Brisbane and the greater Brisbane area. And I want to say that pay respect really to the cultural authority and the leadership of Auntie Peggy Tidyman, Auntie Isabel Tarago, Uncle Alf Lacey and the late Robbie Williams, who really put their shoulder to the wheel in the 90s to create a structure or a reference group in those early times that has really set a lot of things in motion. It's driven not only policy change, rule change, it's platform change. It's actually had an incredible amount of influence on the entire Queensland part of the Labor Party. So what we did notice really is that there seemed to be this kind of, I used the term at first, three kind of waves of collectives that went about organising, and I was readily corrected by Auntie Isabel that was a terrible use of wording. We've gone to phase, but I'm sure there'll be a great debate about how to talk about this, and that's a little bit about the research as well, is that it is really done with and in consultation with people that we are researching with. But as you can see, it's been like a three-phase trajectory. There was this a pretty strong group who laid the foundations through their cultural authority, who they were as Aboriginal people, their connections with community and their own cultural authority, and bringing that into the organisation of the political party. And then, you know, once people kind of run out of puff, and after a little bit of space, this kind of new group really took up the reins and established an Indigenous-led organisation, or what is now known as the Queensland Indigenous Labour Network. And that had an incredible effort, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I guess after that group of people had done their work as a collective, then a new kind of group. And I guess now the QILN is very much a part of the party structure and has a role to play in various ways that I can talk very briefly about. So I guess when we look at the laying of the foundations of the QILN, it was a loose network of Indigenous members in Labor, Queensland Labor. It wasn't a caucus as such, but members, they would come together and see each other at state conferences. As you can imagine, only a very few First Nations members. And by the late 90s, well-respected community members like Auntie Peggy Tidyman of the Woodridge branch and Alf Lacey, who was at the Palm Island branch, and Auntie Isabel Tarago, and the late Robbie Williams were all very, very active members of the party and their communities. And they were also working across important civil service organisations like the Aboriginal Legal Service and in the public service themselves. And I guess when I spoke to Gary Oliver, who went on to be the CEO of our national representative body for a period of time, he said it was very much women driving this early work, organising organising younger people to get involved and do things. So the establishment in 2000 of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Reference Committee of the party was really the beginning of Queensland Labor starting to sit up and take notice. And it started to just lay that foundation and the capacity. The discussions there were really with non-Indigenous members about cultural safety in branches, how to make branches culturally safe for Indigenous people. I mean, this goes back to some of what Fidel was saying earlier. Why would Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want to come into such a white structure, a structure that, you know, comes out of England, you know, coming after work to meet in a political party sort of space? How do you change these branch kind of structures? And when this new group came in, which was really a fantastically, I think, you know, very important time for the Quiln, they reimagined the reference committee, and they were able to have this First Nations-led organisation, a strategic organisation that worked across the factions to influence policy and to really create a space for First Nations people to feel welcome and supported. So one of the kind of big bees in the bonnet was in Queensland Labor, it's a very unusual structure. You have to join a branch and get branch registered in order to have some sort of active participation in the party, like to vote for certain things. So the Quiln worked, for nearly a decade to become a branch registering sort of network of the party, which is really important for Indigenous members to come through and be with other Indigenous members. And I guess the thing that excited us most was that this particular time in the history of the Quiln was a time where the members really got together and started to work politically at each state conference of the party. Every year they'd work out which motions and amendments, and during that time, like at the 2016 state conference, they put forward 52 motions or amendments to policy platform changes, including and achieving the party to be committed to a treaty, which built on their earlier discussion papers and work that they were doing as a collective, and that the senior political advisor to the Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would need to be in an identified Indigenous position. So making quite a big amount of change. There was change to some of the rules that I can't go into right now, but the treaty commitment, and also there was a very big push around stolen wages campaign from stolen generations and earlier parts of the colonisation in Queensland in particular, that weave into a mainstream political party agenda, which is incredible, really. So what happened next? This younger group, this kind of group of really, the second group were really like union organisers, community organisers, very, very strong, very committed people. And so the next kind of group, once the Quiln has been consolidated, as you can imagine, really political operators now, people who are employed within party structures and starting to do that. By that time, there had been an achievement of the first Indigenous woman to be elected into the Queensland Parliament, being Leanne Enoch, who came through from the first phase of Quiln, and now there is Cynthia Louis from the Torres Strait, and also Lance McCallum. It's really just gone kind of threefold. They've achieved a 3% representation in that Parliament, and they've been able to, as I said, get to that point of branch registering through Quiln in this latter phase, and really just setting up now the structural change that was required for Indigenous members of the party to have some power and to get that as a part of the rules and the way that the party worked. So I guess I wanted to just reflect on that. We do understand these things have happened over these 3 phases of First Nations leadership, and we think that the collective work of several members over a very long sustained period of time, so we're talking a 30-year period of time here, created the Quiln as a safe hub for Aboriginal people. They could use it as a branch instead of having to go to their local branch, and it really became a driver for a whole range of individuals in their own leadership journeys as well. Lara Watson, who was very instrumental as the chair in that second phase, kind of talks about Quiln being this stepping stone or foundation, this support structure, a safe space, and having that collective space and commitment and agenda, a collective vision and ideas for what needs to change really did determine that sort of efforts of the collective. And I think there was a lot of discussion about how, even though change inside of these organisations, especially political organisations, happens at a glacial rate, and it does create tensions in communities that Indigenous members of the party were involved in. They really stand staunch in that idea of being very much wanting to be inside the tent. And just a quote from a current Labor senator in the federal parliament, Yarru man Pat Dodson, who is often known as the grandfather of reconciliation in Australia. He said that shifting the Labor Party internally is as critical as achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve. And I think to some degree we've made some significant changes, little changes internally. And you can just see this kind of incremental and the sacrifice these individuals are making as they pragmatically manoeuvre and guide within parties like a political party. So I think what we are hearing and what I want to kind of write more about as we write this work up and conceptualise it is, I think what does self-determination look like within the party was one of the questions that interviewees were bringing up, Quiln was thinking about together. And those ideas around, creating a culturally safe space, having a collective voice, like I'm not just this one person in my branch and have to be the representative of all Indigenous Australia, but also the idea that collectively putting effort in with allies, non-Indigenous members and allies, that change is possible and can happen, and the Quiln were certainly doing it and continue to do that. I think for me, when I look at the literature around collective leadership, the more recent work from Ospina, Foldy, Fairhurst and Jackson, I think this is cell one collective leadership, if you were to say that the lens is the group of leaders. The locus of leadership is the group, that the leadership does reside in this group, that they work together using their drive, honestly, absolute self-commitment to be able to do that, but a whole range of other things. And I think the view is that it is a type of leadership rather than a lens on the leadership. And more recently, the newer work in the Journal of Management Studies, I think this idea I want to explore this idea of interactions of strategic ambiguity. I mean, as you can imagine, political parties are very much susceptible to whatever is most hot at the moment. They're set up as organisations to win elections, obviously, and to run candidates. So how do these more structural, cultural change ideas, themes, party rule changes intersect in that strategic ambiguity. It's a very difficult space that the members are hugging, but their absolute personal and collective commitment to it for Indigenous Australia, which is what they were interested in, was very, very strong. So that's that, Owen. I hope that was somewhat interesting. I'm really happy to talk about it, and as I said, it's quite new work and just starting to get an eye on it.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating stuff, and it speaks to a lot of the things I've been thinking about in recent years, albeit from a very different context and so on. So I've obviously got a couple of things, but I wondered if somebody else wanted to come in first. Anyone? Okay, then I've got a couple of. Two people. Fidel first, then.
Hi, Michelle. A fascinating presentation, I have to say. Just one question. Those elected Aborigines, okay, once they are in office, talking about collective leadership, once they are elected, do they act as sort of delegates or do they act as trustees? In other words, do they follow the party rules or do they look after the interests of the people they are elected to represent?
Yeah, it's an excellent question and somewhat kind of parallel to this particular case. But if I go to Leanne Enoch, who was in a sense the person that was really pushed up by the Quiln from the 90s and moved around, ran a few times. She does both, and so definitely is the member for the seat that she is. She represents those citizens and operates there, has a ministerial role now. But when I visited for interview, and many times I've talked to Leanne, has Quiln members in the office, sees herself as an ambassador, as a person who can shepherd things in the party because of her political clout and leverage and positionality. And individuals, like I'm thinking about it, Fidel, some individuals feel, and it really does depend on how well socialised people are into the party at their candidate run. So you know how people are sometimes like flown in to the party and kind of dropped in or selected by the party leader and said, look, you go and run. And there's just really little to none socialisation in the party. So if those types of candidates go into representative roles, it does create a lot of tension between the sort of work that they want to achieve through political office and what community is calling on them to do, compared to like that party requirements for being, whipped into control of what they need to vote for. So I think it's a really live question and something that I'm going to write about, especially interested in those politicians that just really are there. Like, I'm here for the community. I'm here to do something. I'm going to use this right now. And it's a tough road, man, honestly. It's really, really, really difficult to watch those trajectories, people moving parties, trying to kind of use their leverage to achieve things, and realising how very difficult it is really in that kind of glacial parliamentary way to get anything done. It can really dishearten a person. There are a lot of that broken-hearted people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we've got Jonathan's got his hand up. So Jonathan.
Hi, Michelle. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for that.
Hey,
fascinating account. As I understand it, and if I got it right, Quiln is a kind of internal group within the Labour Party. Is that right?
Correct.
And are there other other internal groups, or is it a sort of unique one within the Labour Party?
No, there's many different special interest groups nowadays, I would say. Yeah, range of different things.
So is Quillen's sort of status within the Labour Party sort of a unique one or a special in some way? What I'm looking at is something about the intersection between the collective leadership of the party structure and the Indigenous leadership, which was the problematic you set out right at the beginning.
Yeah. So there are a range of different structures for women and for diversity. There's just a range that have kind of risen out. I think the First Nations group was very specific and intentional in the 90s, coming out of a real support under the wing of the Emily's List, or the women's Women for Labour movement, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Okay. And is in the way Quillen runs itself within, as a special interest group within the Labour Party,
yes,
what is distinctive about it relative to other special interest groups?
That they operate as a collective, and that and now that they have achieved the branch, almost they are a branch of the Labor Party, so they're not just a special interest group. They've got quite a structural role in the party. So I think there's been a lot of achievement over that period of time to set that up.
Okay, obviously I need to understand a lot more about it to know the next question, but thank you very much. Good to...
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Suzanne had a hand up, but first I noticed Carol had asked a question in the chat. So, sorry, Suzanne. Yeah, we'll just go to Carol first, and then we'll come straight on to you. So the question from Carol in the chat was, I was very struck by the length of time that change took. Do you think that's inevitable in this collective work? I just kind of wanted to connect that a bit to my only comparison is probably not a really good one, but would be with the UK Labour Party and some of the changes that have happened there, particularly around representation of women, which, was dreadful, and then centrally mandated quota system, all of a sudden, huge transformation, very centrally driven, very sudden. And I guess too, when Corbyn took over, it was a very abrupt change, and then the same, Starmer wins, a very abrupt change, and so on. So I guess I'm just thinking aloud in some ways, but you've got this idea of a glacial change, but maybe that offers more of a kind of systemic approach, or a systemic approach to change, and these sort of pendulum swings you tend to get maybe in other contexts. So that's just thinking aloud. But anyway, over to you.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And Carol, I don't know, obviously it's just the one case, and I wouldn't want to ever hazard a generalisable approach, but I do, in this instance, I think it did take time, and it isn't just the work inside of the party. I think there's a lot of contextual factors with what was happening and continues to happen in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, and the push around representation, the push around voice, around governance and treaty, and having a voice to Parliament. I mean, there's just so much noise and important push by Indigenous groups that the Quillen members, who were a part of these various things, obviously through their own community engagement and families, were able to draw on that momentum at certain times and bring those important issues into the party, which I think's been a real positive thing, especially around the stolen wages work. That became such a big achievement in Queensland as compared to other states in Australia. Really, Queensland have really gone about it. So I do think the length of time is really important to note, and how the shift from it being a party reference group, that the party was kind of interested, into being an Indigenous-led organisational part of the party. And I think you're right, Jonathan, being much more articulate about what that structure means within the wider structure and what role it has will be an important part to writing this up. Thank you for that.
Great. So I think we've got time to squeeze one in from Suzanne. So over to you, Suzanne.
Okay. Hi, Michelle. So nice to see you. Here I am on Treaty 1 in Manitoba. Michelle was at our Emerging Issues in Indigenous Business Conference last year, which was wonderful. Met her there. You know, my question is almost exactly what Owain and Jonathan have just been speaking about in the question in the chat. You have this 30-year period, you know, that you're looking at, which I think is so interesting. You know, how would you characterize the shocks or conditions or those external features, as well as the structure of the broader party and how that changed? But, you know, is there some way to theorize what was happening over those 30 years? So, you know, Owain mentioned pendulum swings. I'm not sure if that's what you were seeing. You know, were there things like in Canada, we had the Idle No More movement, as you know, which actually could be associated with increased numbers of Indigenous peoples running for Parliament and legislatures at the provincial level. And now in Manitoba, we have an Indigenous leader of the opposition who's been there for some time. So, you know, the internal structures, and it's called the New Democratic Party, which is equal kind of to your Labour Party. You know, the internal structures have actually led to full party representation by Indigenous people. In some cases, it's still rare, but so I'm also just very interested and would want to encourage you to, you know, take advantage of this amazing look over time that you have, and just see, you know, what were some of those external conditions, events. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and kind of parallel it to the achievements internally as well. Yeah. Certainly, the election of Leanne Enoch, which really changed things, and pretty soon after Cynthia Louis and then Lance McCallum will have the new election soon. I think it's really, there's been a momentum that has created that you could look at the contextual factors of what was happening outside and how it was used inside. Yeah, no, I'll go back to the interviews and have another yarn to them, because I think it is really interesting how the individuals are using both spaces to kind of drive that commitment and also that change. But as you say, Owen, as soon as targets hit, and the Queensland targets aren't as hard as some other parts of Australia, things change quite quickly.
And I mean, Owen, yeah. Just really quickly, just to say, I also fully appreciate you're looking internally, right, at those internal dynamics and the cultural safety and how that was created. Anyway, thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Ciao.
There's so many interesting things in here. We could probably go on all night, but just, Michelle, thanks ever so much for that. We're going to have to draw to a close here.